and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Atheist, agnostic, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds right to you, then you are probably in the right place. So the way we do it here is the members ourselves give the talk, and then afterwards we have a short discussion. Every third Saturday of the month, we have a secular social at Brower's at 3 o'clock, and everyone is invited to that. Every few months, we have a planning meeting, and everyone is invited to the planning meeting so we can hear from you what you want to hear talks on. The church is funded by donations from the members. So there is a donation jar in the back of the room. Even small donations help. And the only thing we, so far, are using our donations for is to rent this space. So without any further ado, let's have Stephen come on up.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming today. I appreciate that. Today I'm going to be talking about the topic of free will. And I just wanted to start by saying a little bit about why we should care about the topic, why you should care about free will. So the main question, and this is the question we're going to address during the talk, is there a fundamental conflict between science and morality? That's really what it comes down to when you're discussing the topic of free will. And more specifically, can science or reason demonstrate that we don't have the ability to make free choices, and therefore that our everyday notion of moral responsibility, including our notions of praise, blame, love, and gratitude, are those notions just fundamentally incoherent? We'll discover that through science. Additional question, if all of that is true, if none of those things are coherent notions, then how can our life have meaning? If we can't be responsible for our actions, how can we take pride in our projects? How can we feel that we have a meaningful life? So that's what's at stake here. Questions about the conflict between sort of what we know about the world and our ordinary conceptions of morality and meaningfulness. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on one philosopher. And the reason I'm focusing, his name is Derk Pereboom. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. I tried to look it up on YouTube. No one introduced him, so I'm guessing it's Derk Pereboom. He's a philosopher, professor of philosophy at Cornell University. He specializes in ethics. He's written a lot of books about free will. This is one of the areas he specializes in. He's had debates with Dennett about it, with Patricia Churchland, two other philosophers I admire quite a bit. The two books that I'm focusing on is he wrote a book in 2001 called Living Without Free Will. And then he created an updated version where he more or less completely rewrote it that he came out with in the first edition was 2014 called Free Will, Agency, and Meaning in Life. So I got sort of two cracks at understanding each of his chapters. That's what I'm basing everything I'm talking about today. All right, so prepare yourself. He makes a lot of distinctions. And I'm not going to make all the distinctions he makes because that would take the whole 20 minutes of this talk. But I did want to get some basic distinctions in place so that when we talk about this after the talk, we have the right terminology so that people can understand the different positions. So the big three positions in free will debates are, number one, something called libertarianism. And the idea behind libertarianism is that, yeah, people have complete free will, they have free choice, humans are the source of their own actions. You can think of libertarian as it's more or less the sort of folk belief, or it's the ordinary sort of belief in how people's decisions actually make a difference to their lives. Probably the strongest kind of form of that is from Christianity, not Calvinism, but sort of Protestant or Catholicism, where you have a belief that there's both a devil and a God, and you have to get through life, and they're tempting you in different ways, but really you have free choice throughout your life to make the right decisions. And that's the libertarian position, the idea that you have control over your own choices and that you could have acted in a different way. Okay, libertarianism. That's usually contrasted with something called hard determinism. And hard determinists believe that everything has a cause, even if in some cases it might be, random. There's still a cause for everything that happens in the universe. Everything can be explained through physical law and by all the causes leading up to whatever happens. They believe that people are no different than a leaf falling from a tree. A leaf falling from a tree, it might be very complicated trying to figure out where it's going to land on a patch of grass. There's wind involved, there's all the forces of nature. But in theory, if you had a strong enough computer, you could predict exactly where that leaf will fall when it falls from a tree. Well, humans are just a more complicated case of that, where we have brains and all this processing, but at the end of the day, if we had a complicated enough computer, we could predict exactly what humans would do. Ignoring a little bit of quantum indeterminacy doesn't really change the fundamental argument. At the end of the day, people are as predictable as every other physical event on Earth. And so that's kind of like the mainstream scientific view, the scientism view, the idea that everything, ultimately can be explained through science, the laws of nature, and previous events. Okay, and then finally, there's compatibilism. And compatibilism actually, my favorite philosopher in the world, David Hume, was a compatibilist, came out of the Enlightenment. The idea behind compatibilism is, sure, determinism is true. Everything follows physical laws. It's all predictable according to physical laws. But there's a ordinary notion of free will, where what we mean in free will when we talk about it in the law, or when we talk about it in ordinary conversation, is that you're not being coerced to do something you wouldn't normally do. So free will is when you can act according to your will. And your will might be determined, but that's really neither here or there. We can still make sense of the ordinary notion of free will just by saying that it means that we're not coerced to do something that we wouldn't normally do. So those are the three sort of main positions on free will: libertarianism, hard determinism, and then there's this compatibilist view in the middle. And just so you know, most philosophers today are compatibilists. They actually did a survey among philosophers, and most voted. That should have zero effect on which one you believe is true. You don't make decisions based on majority vote, but it's interesting that most philosophers do take a compatibilist position. All right, so now that we've got those distinctions out of the way, let me go back to Derk Pereboom, the guy I'm going to be talking about today. So Derk is a hard incompatibilist. And what that means is his main goal is to argue against the compatibilist position in his book. He also refers to himself as a free will skeptic. Now you might wonder why he just doesn't call himself a hard determinist. And he doesn't call himself a hard determinist because he doesn't feel like there's enough evidence to show that everything follows physical law and that you can predict everything from events. So what he's trying to argue is against the lesser claim that somehow our notions of free will are compatible with this idea of hard determinism. So I'm just going to refer to him as a free will skeptic from now on. And he's trying to argue against the compatibilist position, which is, again, the dominant position right now in philosophy. All right, so he writes, the position that I advocate in this book is that there is unlikely that we have the free will required for moral responsibility. So that's a pretty strong claim. He wants to argue, not only is he a hard incompatibilist, he's also not going to be, a wishy-washy philosopher who says, oh, but that's all okay because it's compatible with our existing morality. He actually thinks that our existing morality is suspect. And he has a revisionist account of morality that follows from his hard incompatibilism, which we'll talk about shortly. Okay, and by moral responsibility, just to be clear, the type of moral responsibility he is arguing against is, quote, the sense of moral responsibility, the one at issue in the free will debate, is set apart by the notion of basic desert. Whenever I hear the word dessert, I think of donuts. But what he means by desert is in the sense of getting your just desserts. He means in the sense of deserving something. So, whether or not you deserve blame or praise. So that's the type of moral responsibility. He said that hard determinism shows that we can't, that's unsustainable. For an agent to be morally responsible for an action, in this sense, is for it to be hers in such a way that she would deserve to be blamed if she understood that was morally wrong, and she would deserve to be praised if she understood that was morally exemplary. So he is making the claim in the book that, compatibilism is false. And what follows from that is our ordinary morality is broken. So that's what he's after in the book. All right, so let's get to his arguments. So he has two ways that he argues against compatibilism, because he talks about two approaches that people have for defending compatibilism. And the two types of compatibilism are something called leeway compatibilism and source compatibilism. So let me start with leeway compatibilism. The idea behind leeway compatibilism is the intuition that if you're going to be blamed or praised for something, then it must have been in your power to do that thing, to be able to not do the thing that you're being praised or blamed for. That had to be somehow, you had the option of doing otherwise. That's within, there's an alternative possibility of you not doing the thing that you're being praised or blamed for. Here's an example. This isn't from his book. This is my example. It doesn't quite capture it, but it gives you a sense of what he means by leeway compatibilism. How many people saw the really bad Johnny Depp movie, Nick of Time? Came out like in the 1990s. Vaguely remember? All right, well, I'll tell you the plot of this movie. So in this movie, what happens, he's just an ordinary guy. He's walking through a train station, and then some terrorists, they grab his daughter, and they say, if you don't assassinate this politician, Johnny Depp will kill your daughter. That was the big setup for the movie, and they have a countdown clock, and he's forced, it has to be on it. They give him like this little walkie-talkie, and throughout the whole movie, he's trying to, shoot the politician, because the idea there is he's being forced into doing something that would normally be considered morally reprehensible, killing a politician. But if he doesn't do that, then his daughter dies. That's the setup. So same idea here of leeway compatibilism. The idea is if you really don't have a choice to do otherwise, then you're no longer fully responsible for your action, right? And that's an idea that is enshrined within our legal system. When you enter an agreement of your own free will, what they normally mean by that is, some mobster doesn't have a gun to your head, forcing you to sign the agreement. So Pereboom, though, wants to argue that leeway compatibilism is false. That actually our intuitions about alternative possibilities have nothing to do with our intuitions about moral responsibility. And so he has a thought experiment to explain this. But I just want to make sure you understand sort of the structure of the argument here. He's going to argue that, you might think that alternative possibility is enough for you to think you have free will, but what he wants to argue is, no, alternative possibility has nothing to do with our intuitions about free will. He has a thought experiment where he's going to convince you of that. So let's talk about this thought experiment. Here we go. Black is a nefarious neurosurgeon. In performing an operation on Jones to remove a brain tumor, Black inserts a mechanism into Jones' brain which enables Black to monitor and control Jones' activities. Jones, meanwhile, knows nothing of this. Black exercises this control through a computer which he has programmed so that, among other things, it monitors Jones' voting behavior. If Jones shows an inclination to decide to vote for Carter, then the computer, through the mechanism in Jones' brain, intervenes to assure that he actually decides to vote for Reagan and does so vote. But if Jones decides on his own to vote for Reagan, the computer does nothing but continues to monitor without affecting the going-ons in Jones' head. Suppose Jones decides to vote for Reagan on his own, just as he would if Black had not inserted the mechanism in his head. All right, so let me summarize. Setup is, this book was written a while ago, so he had to vote between Carter and Reagan. And the idea is this neurosurgeon stuck this device in his head such that if he's going to vote for Reagan, the neurosurgeon does nothing. So you're supposed to have the intuition in that case that Jones makes that decision of his own free will, right? Makes it of his own free will. He's morally responsible for voting for Reagan because there is no outside interference by any neurosurgeons or any other outside influences. He just makes that decision. But it's not true that Jones had a choice. in this case. Because if Jones decided they was going to vote for Carter, the neuroscientists would push their buttons, they would do their, fancy computer stuff, they would override that decision, and he would end up voting for Reagan. So this is supposed to be a thought experiment which reveals to you that your intuitions that for you to be morally responsible for an action, you have to have the possibility of taking another action, are false. Because this is clearly a case where Jones had no choice but to vote for Reagan. Because if he did vote for Reagan, he would have voted for Reagan. And so what this means is, he did it of his own free will. He can be praised or blamed for that action. Does that make sense? I'm not asking if you agree with it. Just want to make sure that you understand the thought experiment. All right, so a lot of people, my first reaction when hearing this thought experiment was, it kind of sounds like cheating. The reason that feels like cheating is, Jones does have an alternative choice. I mean, he could have decided to vote for Carter, but then his decision would have been immediately overridden through the intervention of the neuroscientists. So the thought experiment really doesn't show that alternative choices are not necessary for moral responsibility, because there's a sense in which you can make another choice. To handle this objection, Pereboom offers a slightly more complicated example. It's the same idea, except there's one extra step. In this case, the neuroscientist wants to make Jones into a super assassin. And so Jones will either choose to kill Smith, or he will not, right? So neuroscientist wants Jones to kill Smith. The neuroscientist knows that if Jones blushes, he will definitely kill Smith. But if he doesn't blush, he won't. So it's a reliable indicator. So before he makes the choice to kill Smith, he'll either blush or he won't. If he blushes, he knows he's going to do it. If he doesn't blush, he knows he won't do it. So what the neuroscientist does is he sets up his machine so that if Jones does not blush, only in that case will the neuroscientist intervene and cause Jones to decide to kill Smith. So this is a little more complicated because you have the whole blushing thing in there. And the significance of the blushing thing is he still wants to say that we have the intuition that Jones is morally responsible for killing Smith. We have this intuition even though there can be a, what he calls, flicker of freedom. Flicker of freedom between blushing right after Jones blushes and before, there's before Jones doesn't blush and before there's an intervention to cause him to go ahead and kill Smith. So there's a little bit of time there where he's actually kind of right before he makes the choice. But Pereboom wants to argue that it's not robust enough to ground moral responsibility. He writes, these examples do not show that alternative possibilities are not required for moral responsibility. I hate double negatives. He just used a double negative. Rather, what they indicate is that robust alternatives aren't needed. His general conclusion is, our intuitions about free will do not seem to rely on intuitions about alternative possibilities. Therefore, leeway compatibilism does not seem relevant to free will, the whole debate about free will and moral responsibility, and that's why he dismisses leeway compatibilism in general. So that was one of the arguments for compatibilism, that if you have alternative possibilities, that's enough for free will to be compatible with determinism. He claims, no, we don't really have intuitions around that. What we should be focusing on instead is something called source compatibilism. Everyone kind of getting that? All right, fantastic. All right, so let's talk about source compatibilism. The basic intuition behind source compatibilism is that your moral responsibility is a result of you being the source of your actions in the right way. You are morally responsible for something only when you are not caused to do something because of causes outside of your control. So again, I'm going to tell you a story. This is not from Pereboom, but I'm hoping that it'll help sort of explain the intuitions here. How many people know the story of Oedipus Rex? Probably were forced to read it in high school.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, that one. Yeah. So, just as a quick, super short summary of the story, Oedipus was born to the king and queen of Thebes. When he was born, the king went to the oracle, and the oracle said, "Oh, Oedipus, your son is destined to kill your father and and marry his mother." And so the king, being a bright person, said, "I better get rid of this baby." And so what he does is he has the servant put the baby up on the hill. A shepherd finds the baby, and then Oedipus ends up being raised in a neighboring kingdom. And then when Oedipus reaches adulthood, Oedipus goes to the same oracle. And the oracle says, Oedipus, you will marry your mother and kill your father. And so Oedipus goes running away from this neighboring kingdom back to Thebes. He runs into his father. He doesn't know it's his father on the road. They get into a fight. He kills his father. That's the first half of the of what the oracle said was going to happen. Then he runs into a sphinx and answers that riddle that everyone learns in elementary school. And then the kingdom gives him they give him the kingdom. He becomes the king of Thebes, and then he ends up marrying his mother. He doesn't know it's his mother, but he ends up marrying his mother. And then, of course, at the end of the story, he discovers all this being true, and he gouges out his eyes, and it's all dramatic and horrible and bloody and great. But it's a great story. The reason it's such a great story is it plays with all our intuitions about predestination and free will, right? So Oedipus, you feel in some sense that there's nothing Oedipus could have done in that situation. It will be as the oracle said at the beginning of the story. And no matter what Oedipus does, he's going to end up marrying his mother, even if he tries really, really hard. He'll kill his father and marry his mother. And so, in a certain sense, you feel like all of his actions are outside of his control, and so you have a hard time assigning moral blame to Oedipus. Even though I guess you kind of feel good, he gouges out his eyes. I don't know what you're supposed to feel about that, but that's the story. Okay, so Pereboom presents a series of thought experiments that are really just meant to make you think that your own life is just like Oedipus's life, that most of the events in your life are outside of your control, and therefore you don't have free will. So he calls this the four-case manipulation argument. This is the main argument in his book. I'm going to go through the four cases because the idea with the four-case manipulation argument is that you're supposed to start from a case where it's very, very clear that you don't have free will, and then he gets closer and closer to the actual world, and then you're supposed to say, oh, I see, okay, I don't have free will in the actual world either. So that's how this magic trick is supposed to work. So let me start with case number one. Case number one, we're back to the neuroscientists again. A team of neuroscientists has the ability to manipulate Plum's neural states at any time by radio-like technology. In this particular case, they do so by pressing a button just before Plum begins to reason about a situation when they know it will produce in him a neural state that realizes a strongly egoistic reasoning process, which the neuroscientists know will deterministically result in his decision to kill White. Plum would not have killed White had the neuroscientist not intervened, since his reasoning would then not have been sufficiently egoistic to produce this decision. But at the same time, Plum's effective first-order desire to kill White conforms to his second-order desires. In addition, his process of deliberation from which the decision results is reason-responsive, and blah, blah, blah. His reasoning is consistent with his character because it is frequently egoistic and sometimes strongly so. Still, it is not in general exclusively egoistic because he sometimes successfully regulates his behavior by moral reasons. Plum is also not constrained to act as he does, for he does not act because of an irresistible desire. The neuroscientists do not induce a desire of this sort. So the basic setup here that is that they have a button so that when he's about to not kill White, they can go ahead and deterministically cause him to kill White. And the idea is that, Plum shouldn't be held responsible for killing White because it's actually the neuroscientists, again, pressing their button on their machine, which is causing him to kill White. Okay, so just out of curiosity, how many people think that Plum has free will in this case? No one. Oh, one. Fantastic. Very brave. I admire that. Yeah. Okay, so we have one person that says Plum is acting through his free will, even though the neuroscientist is hitting the button and causing the neurons to fire and him to pull the trigger. Okay, case number two. Don't worry, they're getting shorter. Case number two. Plum is just like an ordinary human being, except that a team of neuroscientists programmed him at the beginning of his life so that his reasoning is often but not always egoistic. Same stuff as before. He is causally determined to make his decision to kill when he sees White, yet he does not decide as he does because of an irresistible desire. The neural realization of his reasoning process and of his decision is exactly the same as in case number one, although the causal histories are different. So setup here is the same as the previous setup, case number one, except now, instead of a neuroscientist hitting a button, What they did is, when he was born, they programmed him. They arranged his neurons, they set him up so that when he encounters white, Plum will just shoot him. So he's been programmed since the very beginning to do this. How many people think that he has free will in this situation? Oh, we got one person. Okay. Oh, all right, we got two. All right, getting better. Maybe, yeah, we got three. Okay, so case number 3. This time, Plum is still an ordinary human being, except that the training practices of his community causally determine the nature of his deliberative reasoning processes so that they are frequently, but not exclusively, rational egoistic. So, blah, 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 same stuff as before. Because of his training in his community, when he comes across white, he has to kill him. But he doesn't decide due to an irresistible desire. The neurorealization, I don't know, of his deliberative reasoning process and of the decision is just as it was in cases 1 and 2. So the difference here is no more evil neuroscientists. Instead, he goes through a special training program in his community when he's young, a special school for, forming assassins. And this time, that's why when he comes across white, he has to pull the trigger. How many people feel like he has free will in this case? More. Okay, nice. All right. Some sort of threshold was passed there. Okay, we're starting to get to like 50%. Final case. Case number 4. Everything that happens in our universe is causally determined by virtue of its past states together with the laws of nature. Plum is an ordinary human being raised in normal circumstances, and again his reasoning processes are frequently but not exclusively egoistic, and sometimes strongly so, as in cases 1 through 3. His decision to kill White issues from his strongly egoistic but reasons-responsive process of deliberation, which he has the specified first and second order desires. The neural realization of Plum's reasoning process and decision is exactly the same as in cases 1 through 3. He has the general ability to grasp, apply, and regulate his actions by moral reasons, and it is not because of an irresistible desire that he decides to kill. So this case, everything, he lives in this universe where everything is causally determined with by past states together with the laws of nature. Oh, by the way, that's our universe. But that's the setup. And now when he comes across white, he pulls the trigger and he kills him because of all the events that came before him. How many people think he has free will now? All right. Okay, tipping point. I think we got maybe 60%, so we got over there. So the idea of these thought experiments are, again, the idea is to gently move you toward the position of believing that, Plum never had free will, even though Plum is Oedipus Rex. He just doesn't know it. Plum is Oedipus Rex. He will marry his mother and kill his father no matter what happens because all this stuff is out of his control. So the idea of this is, again, there's 2 arguments for compatibilism. There's the leeway compatibilism, and then this is called source compatibilism. Pereboom believes that source compatibilism is a source of our intuitions about moral responsibility. He thinks it's right in capturing when we think we're morally responsible, but he also thinks that given the universe we live in, what it shows is incompatibilism is true, compatibilism is false, because we know, on the basis of those intuitions, if we think it through, we all know that we are just like Oedipus Rex. All right, so that's his main argument. So what does he conclude from all this? So let's talk a little bit about the results he thinks this has for how we should live our lives. First, he concludes that determinism of this sort is not compatible with moral responsibility. So that has to go away. In particular, he interprets his argument as demonstrating that the concept of deserving praise or blame is just incoherent. You deserve nothing. You deserve nothing. So this is the just deserves part. Because Pereboom believes that free will skepticism is incompatible with deserving praise or blame, he believes that certain emotions are always unjustified. He's a cognitivist when it comes to emotions, so he thinks that there's a belief component to them. In particular, he believes that a central component of the emotions of indignation and resentment is a belief that the target of indignation and resentment deserves to be blamed. So you can't be resentful unless you feel like, someone deserves to be the object of blame, but because he doesn't believe in this idea of desert, you're not really allowed to, feel indignant anymore or resentful. So he therefore believes that both of these emotions are always unjustified. And that carries over to certain types of blame and praise. Only certain types of blame and praise make sense. If you're talking about anyone deserving blame, no, can't deserve blame, can't deserve praise. But he does believe that there's a certain narrow sense of blame that's sometimes justifiable. He writes, I propose, in harmony with free will skepticism, to ground this model for blame not in basic desert, but in 3 non-desert invoking moral desiderata. Protection of potential victims, reconciliation to relationships both personal and within moral community more generally, and moral formation. Immoral actions are often harmful, and we have the right to protect ourselves and others from those who are disposed to behave harmfully. Immoral actions can also impair relationships, and we have a moral interest in undoing such impairment through reconciliation. And because we value morally good character and resulting action, we have a stake in the formation of moral character when it's plagued by dispositions to misconduct. So his general conception of blame and praise as well is essentially forward-looking. It all has to be forward-looking. It's all about future predictions, future reconciliation, and future moral reformation. So, deserts are about judging the past. Praise and blame only makes sense if you're talking about trying to change people for the future. That's where everything's focused on. All right, finally, I want to talk about, he has a chapter on the meaning of life. I can't skip over that chapter. That would be wrong if he's going to write a chapter, on the meaning of life. We have to discuss it a little bit. Pereboom discusses a thought experiment developed by the philosopher Trevor Pescoda that appears to demonstrate that free will skepticism is incompatible with having a meaningful life. In this thought experiment, the target agent is Tom, an admirable person who devotes considerable time and energy to poverty relief and is successful in his endeavors. Suppose he is manipulated by those neuroscientists again to take on and be committed to this project, and this is revealed to him. Would he continue to see his efforts as a source of meaning and fulfillment? So the setup here is, poor Tom. He spent all of his life helping the poor. This is something very meaningful to him. He woke up every day. He did what he could. He was getting to the end of a full life of helping poor people. And then the neuroscientists show up and said, oh, hey, guess what, Tom? We actually manipulated you into doing that for your entire life. How do you feel about that? That's the setup for the thought experiment. So what Pereboom writes is, Tom would, I contend, be shattered to hear the news about the true nature of his life and of his commitment to the fight against poverty. What was once for Tom a source of pride and satisfaction would cease to be so. Perhaps Tom would take some solace in the fact that he was created and manipulated by nice neuroscientists, not evil ones, nice ones. After all, they could have manipulated him so as to be rationally egoistic, in which case he probably would have been a much nastier person than he was. And perhaps he can be glad that, as things turned out, he took satisfaction in his altruism. The discovery of his manipulation certainly does not take away the subjective experience of satisfaction that he has had. But as we've already seen, there is more to meaningfulness than subjective experience. On finding out about his manipulation, it seems reasonable to suppose that Tom would cease to see his life as meaningful. Crucially, I think Tom would cease to see the life he has lived as his in any important sense, as seeing the life as his would appear to be a prerequisite for viewing it as meaningful. So that's actually, so the objector here, Trevor, is saying that, well, if we really went along with everything Pereboom is saying, we've just, potentially removed all the meaning from our life. Thank you very much, Pereboom, for doing that to us. So Pereboom has a response to this. Notice, by the way, this is an application of Pereboom's own manipulation argument against him. So this was the same sort of setup of neuroscientists, but this time it's being used against Pereboom. His response to this is, our life's projects often form a unifying theme when we tell our life stories. But as I've argued, the meaning that derives from our projects, and hence in this respect from the stories, does not require that we act freely in the sense required for basic desert involving moral responsibility. Remember, he doesn't believe in desert. So here is a story that is not uncommon. We fell in love. We didn't plan to have our child, but having her was fabulous. And this romantic relationship and our family are the best things in our lives. The key elements of such stories are independent of what we freely will. while they are very often what is the most important for making our lives meaningful. So that's Pereboom's response. He's saying basically, you don't really have any control over everything, but that doesn't remove the meaning from it, right? Things happen, and you can still, find meaning in what happens. All right, so conclusion. Getting to the very end, just want to give a quick summary. Pereboom wants to argue that leeway compatibilism is wrong. That was the first argument. In other words, our intuitions about moral responsibility are not grounded in thoughts about you could have done otherwise or alternative possibilities. That's in disagreement with Hume, that's fine. He also wants to argue that source compatibilism is wrong. Our intuitions, what he wants to say is our moral intuitions are grounded in our intuitions about the source of our actions. That we don't feel like Oedipus had free will because everything was determined outside of his control. That's the true nature of our intuitions about free will come from the source of our actions. But he wants to say through the 4-case manipulation thought experiment that in fact we don't have control over all the events that lead up to do what we do, and so we really don't have free will. Hard incompatibilism is true. Therefore, we do not have free will, therefore we should all be free will skeptics. That was the conclusion from his 4-case manipulation thought experiment. And then finally, what all this means is we need to revise our morality and how we find meaning in our lives, because the deserved sense of blame or praise is unfounded, because you, again, don't deserve anything, because it's outside of your control. And you need to find meaning even if what you do does not result from your free will. That's it. So let's stop here and discuss.